Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. In part one, I showed the inspiration for this jacket, how I came to have a 9-inch wide sampler in double weave from a guild workshop with Jennifer Moore, and how I decided on what part of the sampler to put where. Now we can get to the actual construction. Once I had a layout for each garment section, the next thing I did was create a line of basting 1/2 inch or 3.8 centimeters from all the cut edges, mounting the 2 layers of each pattern section together. I knew eventually that I would be sewing the top layer of the garment together in the traditional way by machine, but the inside layer would need to be sewn by hand at each seam. I needed space to turn back the seam allowances without interfering in the double weave windows I was about to create. Next, I ran a grid of basting parallel and perpendicular to the grain lines. What I didn't want was for any of the double weave samples to be crooked. Next step was to position the double weave pieces onto the garment sections and make sure they were parallel to the basting that indicated the grain lines. Since my demonstration sample here is a rectangle, there was no need to add basted grain lines. I just needed to make sure the sample was parallel to the basting. I basted around each of the double weave samples. There was a lot of basting. I trimmed the sampler to fit where it bumped into the basted garment section perimeter. The next step was to draw a chalk line in 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters all around the sample outline. Now, the moment of truth. I cut through both layers of the jacket on the chalk line, creating a window opening that was 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters smaller than my double weave sampler all the way around. I could now insert the double weave sample between the layers. I carefully chalked 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter from the cut edge of the window on each corner. The corners were a problem. To turn under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters on each edge of the window on each side of the garment meant cutting into the corner points, and I found they raveled easily. Normally, I would reinforce stitch an inside corner like that, but it wasn't realistic in this case. I did some experimenting, and I found that Aleene's Tacky craft glue could be applied in the corner. It dried almost instantly, and it could be applied with the end of a very small flathead screwdriver, one from my sewing machine, and the glue didn't spread. It dried clear, and it gave me a sturdy base to cut into the corner all the way. I'm sure someone will ask, what about freight check? I can't answer that because I don't own any. As long as it doesn't bleed beyond the corner, I don't see why it wouldn't also do the job. It does take a lot longer for freight check to dry, from what I understand, than this tacky glue. Carefully fold under the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance and pin in place. I used a small slip stitch, so the stitches were really invisible. And since it was a double layer of hand-woven fabric, I didn't have to worry about the needle catching the underside. The stitches just slipped between the layers of hand-woven cloth. I spent a couple months just working piece by piece, edge by edge. When I finished reverse applique stitching the front side, I flipped it over and stitched the reverse. Once all the reverse applique was completed on all the sections, I could now assemble the garment. I started with the zipper. I looked for a long time for a separating jacket zipper that was reversible, that wasn't black. I was able to find a site on Etsy that not only had colors, but would cut the zipper to any length. I found my zipper at Huntington Fabric U.S. That link is below. A reversible zipper has a zipper pull that can flip to the other side when the jacket is worn inside out. I pressed under the seam allowances in the center fronts of the jacket and the lower edges. It was a bit tricky at the lower edge. I ended up creating a miter to allow the lower edge to turn up as well without bulk. With right sides together, bring the lower edge to the center front edge, creating a bias fold. I like to press just the corner fold to make it more stable for stitching. Measure down perpendicular from those cut edges 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. Draw a line perpendicular to the bias fold, intersecting the 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeter mark. Stitch along that chalk line. Trim seam allowances and clip off the corner point. Now you have two finished right angles that create a lovely finish at the bottom of the jacket front. I basted the halves of the zipper between the layers. I top stitched through all layers, and then I could start stitching the rest of the jacket together. To construct the rest of the jacket, I kept the underneath layer pinned out of the way, and I stitched the shoulder seams of the outer garment. Then I added the drop shoulder sleeves. That allowed me to stitch the fronts and backs starting at the lower edge of the garment and continuing through the lower edge of the sleeve. Once the outer garment was together, I stitched the inner garment seams completely by hand. And that left the collar and the hems. Hems were easy. I just pressed the seam allowances of the lower edge of the garment and the sleeves in towards each other and slip stitched the two layers together on the edges. I stitched the outer layer of the collar to the jacket through all layers and then folded the seam allowances back and hand stitched the inner layer of the collar all the way around. I would have liked to have had some interfacing in the collar, but that wasn't realistic if the collar were to be reversible like the rest of the garment. And so, after months of hand stitching, which was a lot easier with a broken shoulder, I have a jacket. And I have a completely reversible jacket. I'm not sure which side I like better. They're both so different. Actually, this technique could be used for any scraps or workshop samples. And if the piece is lined, there's no need to make it reversible. You could just mount a section across an upper back, cutting out a window in the fabric, and stitching reverse applique onto the sample. Hello, Mulder. I've heard people tell me that they don't like to take workshops because all they get is a drawer full of samples. I say, open that drawer and see what ingredients you can find for your next garment. I'm Daryl Lancaster for the Weaver Sews.